This is the Abaddon Planet Podcast, episode 47. I'm your host, Joel Abaddon. Thank you for joining me on this never-ending quest to figure out how to teach better. Today on the podcast is Dr. Natalie Hobson, assistant professor in the Department of Mathematics and Statistics at Sonoma State University. And I haven't known Natalie for all that long. We got hooked up through a mutual academic acquaintance to create some partner publications on thinking about equity and math education at the higher ed level. And then we did a presentation where we had a chance to share with each other what we had wrote in those partner publications. And then we had a chance to answer some questions about it. But the conversation was rich and we had a lot to say and not a lot of time to say it. And we thought, you know what? Let's move that conversation over to this platform. So we have the Abaddon Planet podcast episode that you're about to listen to. So we're going to talk about the background of the work we kind of did in tandem. We're going to kind of recap a little bit of our conversation, extend it a little bit more. We're going to ask each other some questions, and really around this idea of thinking about what if you're going to get started thinking about equity, which, you know what, there's lots of calls to be doing that. And, you know, there's people that are doing things that may not know the labels and the names and the terminology. And maybe this might be a good start for anyone thinking about equity in their classroom, in their place of work, wherever. Again, we kind of have a broad idea of what teaching is at the Abaddon Planet podcast. So wherever you're thinking about equity, maybe this could be a great conversation for you as well. So without further delay, here's my conversation with Dr. Natalie Hobson. Dr. Natalie Hobson, thank you so much for joining me on the episode of the Abaddon Planet podcast. How are you?
Doing well. Thanks for having me, Joel.
It's my radio voice coming out full nice. Force at you.
Sounds good.
So Natalie, we've had a chance to briefly meet, and no pun intended with the word brief. We'll get into that in a second. We're going to talk about our briefs that we wrote for a little, I don't know, what a web document, I guess, is for helping people getting started.
A resource guide.
Yeah, a resource guide. We'll talk about that in a second. But we decided, hey, let's do a podcast episode. That'd be kind of fun to talk about some of the work we've been doing together and also just to develop this relationship a little bit more. But before we get into it, you know what? I kind of want to know a little bit. Can you give me a little bit of background on who is Dr. Natalie Hobson?
Yeah, well, so I'm currently an assistant professor at Sonoma State University in their math and statistics department. My educational background, I have a PhD in mathematics and also a master's degree in math education. And I completed these degrees at the same time concurrently. I always sort of knew that I wanted to be a math teacher. That's kind of why I went to get my math degree. It was an means to an ends of working with students. Math really never came easy to me growing up or in school. I was very curious and I worked really hard in math, and I just loved connecting with other people through mathematics. So that idea of being able to communicate with other people, how I'm thinking about something and trying to understand how someone else is conceptualizing a mathematical pattern or mathematical structures was something that really intrigued me. So as I continued through mathematics, I started to really see the privilege that succeeding in math gave me. Mm-hmm. So when I would tell someone that I was getting a math degree, I would often get a response of, wow, that's so impressive. You know, sometimes I'd get like, oh, I hate math. And that would be end of conversation. But, and the more I did math or further I went in mathematics, the more I also realized how rather arbitrary this privilege was. You know, I had friends who, like, I worked really, really hard in grad school and school. But I recognized that, you know, I had friends who were working, 60 plus hours a week. It came from a low income, drug impacted family, were raising their siblings, working really, really hard as well. And yet I was the one who was getting praise for my hard work. And so that's kind of where my goal and mission is in working with students in math, is to try to support students so that mathematics isn't a barrier for them for reaching their goals. And so that also they can start to become more empowered through becoming doers of mathematics and being able to use some of those mathematical skills to, kind of take control of their life and to not I guess to take control of their life, not control maybe, but become empowered to, I don't know, get the privilege that math success can provide them.
Yeah. I mean, I always say, I think I got this from Bob Moses in Radical Equations, like access to academic and economic opportunities, right? Like there are these doors that open up, and not that that's the only thing, but seriously, like all these doors that are open because of your relationship with mathematics, like, hey, you get a handful of keys if you have a good relationship with mathematics.
Oh, for sure.
And can see how, the ways that you're interacting with the world, the math that you're already doing, and how that translates into school mathematics. I mean, that's, which is kind of cool with your story. I mean, you see like where you are and like to talk about like, hey, my relationship has not been all, sunshine and lollipops. It's been, there's been some struggles. It sounds like a good, like a relationship, like a relationship with stories, behind it. Like there were some rough times in the late 90s,
Yes, for sure. And I always saw like in the classroom, I always felt like I was the one behind in mathematics. So it was never something of like, oh yeah, of course this should be easy. But it was just something I was really curious about.
Yeah. So it's kind of like all this stuff, and maybe even like towards the topic that we're going to talk about is like moving towards, equity in math ed, is thinking about, it's not something that you are going to have locked down, right? It's not like I am a math person. I'm always a math person. No, I'm constantly, and it's just like, we're just talking about kids and partners and stuff. It's like, I have a wife, and like my relationship with her is like just up. Yep. I know her, done.
Always evolves. Yeah. Like, right. It's not like that. Yeah.
That's not going to work out too well.
Right. For sure.
Like, what? You're changing? What? I don't know that.
Right. It's like a huge form where we only can see certain parts at once, and we can develop a bigger picture, but we're always in that developing process, even with teaching.
Yeah. Well, and too, you talk about the fascination you have with how people solve problems. I mean, and that's what I'm trying to do with my elementary teachers, is that for them to like throw out a nice messy task with multiple ways to approach it. And all of a sudden these kids who have these imaginations start just throwing stuff and like, oh my gosh. And you expose the genius that's there.
So true. Yeah.
Because you just provided the opportunity, and it's like, there is fascination, and you get, and then you develop an even better relationship with mathematics, because you get to see how other people know. Like, did you know math in this way?
So true.
Yeah. So that's pretty cool.
Or did you know that other people could conceptualize these things like this?
Yeah.
Like, it's fascinating. Gosh. Yeah.
One of the first episodes of this podcast, I talk about a time when a kid solved a problem with a table. Like, it was like basically like find the slope, and I was thinking strictly symbols, right? And then the kid comes up
like a table of numbers.
Yeah. Can I use a table? Okay. And he's like, oh, I see the jumps, and I can jump back to when X is 0 and see what the Y intercept. And it was like, and my mouth was like on the floor, and it was like, oh, wow. Like multiple representations, which is just like, wow, my relationship with math. And it was just like an exposure. My relationship to math was really limited. And this kid just showed me something. Yeah. I was the teacher. And like, but no, in that case, he was the teacher. And that fluidity.
Because we come to a mathematical problem with our experiences, with our perspectives. And that's so limiting, right? Even though it feels like, oh, math, there's one answer. Never true. Like there's so many paths, and
Wow. So we're breaking some ground here. We're not breaking ground, but we're letting it be known.
Touching on. Yeah.
Yeah. That there is, wow, we're bringing biases and perspectives into math classroom. The universal language, like, we're bringing in some perspectives, folks, so
totally
fantastic. So what did we get to do? We got on an email together, and all of a sudden like, oh, I guess I'm doing some things with Natalie. But, we were invited to write briefs for a getting started with equity. And I think I'm butchering that title, but we'll have links to everything that we mentioned in the show notes for this episode. But we were offered a chance to write a brief to department chairs, and thinking like, if you're going to get started with equity, what from my perspective, and then from your perspective, what would you say? So we each had individual briefs that we then are included in this web document on thinking about teaching mathematics at the higher ed level. So I did mine from a teacher ed perspective, but again, if I was a teacher ed person talking to math departments about, hey, here's some things to think about with regards to equity, and had like 5 main points. And then same thing for you, but you're coming from, well, you kind of, I mean, like in your background, you do have a math ed perspective, but you have a math department perspective too. I don't know if I'm pigeonholing you too much.
No, yeah, I have, like I've said, my interest is really in the teaching aspect, and getting a math PhD, I had to seek out a lot of opportunities on my own to develop myself as a teacher. And so the courses I teach right now are primarily math content, but I also teach some math content for future teacher classes. Yeah. So I kind of enjoy all the things.
And I want to give a shout out because there's some great people that like, so you were you got your degrees at the University of Georgia.
Yes, that is correct.
And so I don't know a lot of the math department people, but I know some of the math education people like Kevin Moore. You said you had a chance to interact with. Kevin Moore
was my master's advisor. And so it was amazing working with him and on his team. With that group, I really sort of got the exposure of what it was like to really take students' thinking very seriously.
Yes. Underline that 1,000 times. Yes.
That's great. We would spend hours looking at one video clip of a student saying, 3 sentences, but really trying to dive into trying to get an idea of the landscape of someone else's thinking. Yeah. And that really was an amazing experience. And
just to bring some context, do you remember like what topics you were looking at with like maybe those 3 sentences? Do you like, was it trig functions? Were you doing
so we were looking at students thinking with graphs. So how is a student conceptualizing a graph? In particular, how are they conceptualizing a graph that is representing 2 quantities that change together? And so there is so much to unpack there. And, someone looking at that who maybe just has experience or just has a math background without the education could think, okay, well, this is a graph. It's representing this one relationship. Done. It's like, wow, no, there's so much we could unpack.
Yeah. And similarly, I had a chance to work with Amy Ellis, who's now at the University of Georgia. She was at Wisconsin, and similar thing we're talking about exponential functions and just thinking about kids thinking around, which
growth
again, could dive so deep on kids thinking. So that's kind of cool that we have that similar background.
Yeah. That's awesome.
All right. So we wrote these briefs, and so we had a chance to write that. So when you were writing your brief, like what were like, maybe we can share some of again, we'll have the links to everything, but maybe what are some highlights that you wanted to bring up with what you wrote about in your brief?
Awesome. So when I was writing my brief, I tried to think what would be most helpful for someone who is teaching mathematics, who doesn't necessarily have a lot of background in teaching or how to teach, who hasn't thought about these ideas as much. So what I tried to do is really make concrete suggestions of what it could look like in the classroom to support, a diverse students or a collection of students, a bigger collection of students. So that's sort of where my head was at. And I tried to organize my suggestions around some main points in the literature that I reviewed. And so should I outline those suggestions?
Yeah. And again, people can dive deeper into them, but I mean, you kind of had some main kind of pillars there.
Yeah. So my main pillars started about what recommendations for change starting from the school or department level. So first of all, that includes placement into math classes. So, broadening how to, broadening those placement metrics rather than just looking at one kind of data point, looking holistically at the student, looking at their potential, not just looking at what experiences they were given in high school, for example. Then also, once after placement, providing students diverse pathways to meet their math requirement. So, not limiting, say, the possible math classes to just a calculus class, but providing more flavors or types of math that can, afford students what they need for their degree. And then from there, I have some recommendations of possible changes within the classroom. So starting out focusing on belonging, I think, Joel, that was something that was also quite present in your brief as well. Mm-hmm. Then, in terms of in the classroom, focusing on or making sure your curriculum is very student-centered, mm-hmm. Encouraging a growth mindset in your classroom, really being explicit about communicating your expectations, since, all of our students don't always have a culture of higher ed in their background.
Right.
And then also from there, sort of focusing on faculty development in terms of bias training or implicit bias training, and increasing access in other ways by making the department a more inclusive community.
Yeah. I mean, overall, thinking about those pieces, mm-hmm. one, you can kind of hear where some of these things, you can see where some of them emerge from your story too, and thinking about student-centeredness and things like that. But even I always think of this as flipping on switches. And so again, maybe similar to you, you're talking about having a privileged background in a math classroom, mm-hmm. and I didn't realize, maybe, you've told similar stories on previous episodes, but thinking about when I was doing math, I could see success. A lot of times the teacher looked exactly like me, especially right now, with the glasses and the gray hair and all that stuff. But, but even, could see if I struggled, I see, someone in front of me that's
right
being successful at this, but then how do we go about it? But even as a first generation college student, or first generation college graduate, and thinking about the communicating expectations, mm-hmm. office hours and like that, what are the purpose of those? And I've seen just even this past year when we had the ability to use Zoom, and it was very, very easy to have several meetings back to back and just, making some clicks, arranging mm-hmm. these meetings to have with students. So that's no matter what, I'm touching base with you, even if you're doing great, we can say, hey, you're doing great. Or mm-hmm. maybe they think they're doing great, or they're not doing great. And mm-hmm. they would have avoided that meeting at all costs. But it's nice to say, hey, what's going on? Oh, you're having this issue. I have empathy. I've experienced that same issue. And how can I provide you space in order to accommodate that situation with your family, but then also too, to get this work done. And so I don't know, there's mm-hmm. lots of things there that, and people mm-hmm. are well, where's the math there? Well, again, the relationship that they're going to build with math, a lot of times is going to depend on the relationship they have with you as the instructor. Mm-hmm. So,
totally.
I don't know.
And I think that also goes along with what we were saying about, with a math problem, we have one way of approaching it. With office hours, we have one way of approaching it. So we might think, office hours, that's a time where my students can come and ask me questions. Done, right? Yeah. So if a student has questions, then it's easy. They should just come. But there's a lot more to it. A student could see an office hour as, that means I quote unquote need help. So maybe that labels me a certain way. So maybe I don't want to do that. Yeah. Or, these, office hours, do I need an appointment? I don't want to see a doctor. Do I have to, is this so there's so much more to it than just this is easy. I have office hours done. I'm supporting my students. No, there's maybe more we can do. So yeah, I like your suggestion, Joel, of having, required check-in meetings so that you can just, address individual student needs.
And even I've heard my co-host of the Teaching Math Teaching podcast, mm-hmm. Ava Thanheiser, she had a different word of saying it, but it was almost a chance to talk to the instructor hours or something like that. Even because even just the word office hours, what does that actually mean?
Right.
And then if you add the list, all the things that would go into going to a physical office hours, finding the office, knowing where it is. And I remember when I was trying to do that in Van Vleck at the University of Wisconsin, which was a huge building and these very small offices, and you're peering in and there's books everywhere. And it's should I come in here? Cause this this seems a little intimidating whereas I think my office that I'm in right now, it feels comfortable, but still that can be very intimidating for somebody.
Especially a student who commutes an hour to campus and then has to find parking and then has to navigate to the building. And then, if you go to the office hour and your instructor's door is partially closed.
Yeah.
They could get so close and still be afraid to knock,
Yeah, so close.
So we really need to be, having a lot of direct, direct energy to help students in that way.
Yeah. So again, actionable things again. And mm-hmm. so the name of the report I actually did find, Getting Started with Equity, a guide for academic department leaders. I was close. And, thinking about your actionable things or suggestions for change, some of those are, diverse pathways that might take the department to really look at their thing. But the other things like sense of belonging, student-centeredness, communicate expectations, even engaging in some bias training, which, there's some out there that you can access, just even to become more knowledgeable about. You can take steps towards that fairly quickly, and which I really appreciated about what you wrote in the brief. I'm going to jump into mine if that's okay.
Please.
Yeah. So in my brief, I kind of took I'm the teacher at the professional development where someone has been asked to come in and talk to us about something, and was like, oh, like, why should I listen to this person? What is your, what kind of authority do you have? And so, and thinking like, I'm just a professor at the University of Mississippi, and why I want to make sure what I'm providing is not only things that I think, but also things that I can point to some of the organizations that, support undergraduate math education would agree with as well. And so, in thinking about that, I had, some suggestions as well, where I summarized areas for concern. And one thing was a great quote that I found from a common vision for undergraduate mathematical sciences programs in 2025. It's by MAA, or the Mathematical Association of America. They had a quote to that the status quo is unacceptable. That was really just stood out. It's like, no matter what, we need to make some changes. We need to make some changes to do some of the things that you talked about, but then just do some things in order to improve math education, because it is important. It is important to provide, again, like we talked about before, access to academic and economic opportunities, but also to meet some of these grand challenges that we have facing us in this world. And so in thinking about that, my suggestions for change were fairly brief, but then also parallel a lot of things that I saw within the documents. And then some of the resources I shared had to go along with that, but differentiate equity and equality. And so sometimes people initially, when they get in these conversations, they start thinking of those two things are the same, and they're not. Like, to do the same thing for everyone. I treat everyone the same. Well, everyone's not the same. And so equity and NCTM talks about high expectations and strong support. So yeah, you might have the same expectations for folks, but some folks might need more support. And we saw that a lot in 2020, where I'm going to expect everyone to be online for a class. Well, having access to the internet, some folks that was not an issue, some folks that was a big issue. And so there's different levels of support that are needed. So that's a pretty, straightforward example of sort of that difference between equity and equality. Asset-based perspective of students, promoting diverse perspectives. I thought that there were some things that were parallel in your brief. Working with math educators, hey, that's kind of what we're doing right here. So having that connection between if there's a math ed department and a math department on a college campus, that there can be some communication happening there. And in our talk that we gave at the remote summit, which I think we might be able to put a link to some stuff there maybe. But we kind of talked about like, hey, that's something I know I need to be better about, is making those connections to our math department here on campus, because I know some of our students, a lot of our students take courses over there. And then give space and support for improvement. And so whenever you're going to think about making changes to make your classroom, even think about some of the things that you talked about in your brief, think about student-centeredness and thinking about like bringing a sense of like you're going to be doing things differently within your classroom, and not everything is going to go perfect. And so, yeah, there might be some bumps in the road, but that's what happens when you're going to make improvements, right? You're going to have some things. So give space and support for improvement. And so thinking like, no, I expect everything to chug along a straight line going upward all the time. Like, no, we need to, if we're going to change the way we're teaching, if we're going to change some things in our classroom, like, it's not just going to be, if all of a sudden in our math department, they started doing things that in groups and started doing things, using complex instruction or something like that. yeah, that's going to be some change. There's going to be some pushback too, because it's not the traditional math classroom, and you might even get a parent calling or something because it's different, but it's different because we're trying to make it better. And so giving that space and support for improvement. So that, and then I just named a bunch of resources that kind of went along with those. And that's what's kind of cool. I loved your resources that I put down and have mine. And again, those briefs will be available in the show notes for this podcast, which we'll mention later. But so maybe we should talk about, what did we learn? Or should we do that? Or did you have something you wanted to go into?
Yeah, I did. Well, so Joel, I guess, well, let's go into what we learned. So I'll just say, Joel, when I read your brief, I really appreciated how brief it was. It was very explicit with some, main sort of holistic big picture ideas that I think are great for setting a foundation in this work. I think there's many sort of questions I had while reading the brief in terms of what some of your suggestions actually look like concretely or explicitly. So I do have some questions, if you don't mind.
Okay.
Maybe
sure.
A few questions.
Yeah. Let's keep the learning going.
Cool. So just starting with the differentiate equity versus equality. So when I was reading this, I was sort of curious about what that looks like to you in terms of what different supports look like for different students and how to identify those supports that are needed. It also kind of going along with that, sometimes by assessing students in certain ways that will label students. So I also am fearful of, identifying this student needs extra support and the other consequences that could have on that student. So I guess there's a lot of questions there, but that's sort of where my head was circling around.
Yeah. So, one of the things and I might be going around about to get to the answer. One of the things when I saw when we went to online learning this past year, and some of and people had to make adjustments to their teaching in order to do that. And so we could maintain social distance and all that good stuff. So some of the big complaints were, I can't assess, trying to think how do you do a paper and pencil assessment online, right? And having proctors through Zoom that are watching you as you it became all this thing of how do we see what kids know, right? And it was how do I see instead the answer was, how do I see what kids know that wouldn't disrupt my own teaching and what I've already been doing for years and years, right? And so thinking about, I need to know, I want to understand what concepts from this course. And so I have this one way that I've been using, and now maybe I can't use it because of, COVID and having to do some things online. But how do I provide you opportunities to demonstrate your understanding? And thinking about, there are different ways to demonstrate understanding. And even we talked about in the example of, I wanted to show how to do something with symbols, and a kid wanted to show me with a table. And, thinking about it, we both solved the same problem. We both had different ways to get at it. But there was different, representations to do it. And maybe then there's also different mediums to do it too. If a kid can tell me exactly what they're supposed to do, but they might struggle with the writing part of it. So now I might say, yes, I do value the writing it out, and we're going to provide you with supports in order to do that. But if the main thing is the conceptual understanding, and you have shown me conceptual understanding in a verbal way, you multiple examples, whatever, I can document it.
Right. Well, you can assess that.
Right. And versus the other kid, what? I just wrote it down. Here you go. And so there's two different ways of providing the assessment. So and yes, we want both of them to see the value in the other one's way. We want them both to be able to express it in both ways. But, but we all have this thing where we all see a menu and we're like, ooh, I'd like to eat that. There's a menu of ways that we can show our understanding, and some of them are easier than others. And so, providing the support in order to show or demonstrate your understanding in multiple ways could be a way that we're providing, we want everyone to show that understanding, but there's differences in how they might be able to do it. And so, or how they might be able to express it. And so that's just one way that I see it coming out in some of those examples. And like the meetings that I had with folks where some, you know, that was for like a lesson planning class. So we'd have lesson plans that they'd have to develop for like elementary math teachers developing these lesson plans. In those meetings, you could see like the complexity of the thinking, which could be expressed through the on the document versus having a conversation. And yet both of them could translate well to good instruction. Right.
Yeah.
And so, and just like you said, like, hey, there's, you know, Joel, you're brief with your brief, but you know, I can go deeper into each of them, but there's just a different way of expressing it. So I don't know. Does that help?
I like that. Yeah. And I think when I first sort of was thinking about differentiating equity versus equality, I was focusing more on, I guess, you know, I mean, my own bias, I was sort of focusing on more of a deficit view of students, right? So I was thinking, okay, well, so this means certain students are, you know, have certain deficiencies, so we need to support them more. And it sounds like your, you know, interpretation of this is more along the lines of how can I open up my assessment or my curriculum so that I can see more students, I can see their understanding and thinking more. And I like that. I like that idea.
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt. But I was just wondering, like, you probably have at the beginning of a academic semester, you'll have like students that coming up and they've got some supports that, you know, the university said, hey, these are supports you can give them. And a lot of times those supports are written for classrooms that look nothing like mine. Right.
Yeah.
Like I'm using the groups, I'm trying to, you know, emphasize cooperative learning, and the assignments I have are performance-based, and they're not, you know, like a written exam,
not a test, like,
a timed written exam.
Time and a half. Okay. Yeah. What does that mean? Yeah.
Exactly. And so it's like, you know, I look at, we go through the supports together. And I'm like, you know what, these will not be an issue. And all of a sudden, like, you know, what the student sees as a, you know, a deficit in their, like, it's almost been it's still there, but it's not, it doesn't have to be highlighted in this class. Right. And so thinking about how do we structure our classes so that, you know, and next to me, I've got a doorknob that's not a knob, it's a handle with, you know, so even a child can open it, which, you know, maybe you don't want a child to open the door, but, you know, but like, but
it allows more access.
Right. Allows more access. So if I have a child, or if I have a hook for a hand, or like, there's so many ways that I can open that door versus the one way with the knob. So like, maybe we're providing more universal access. Previous episode of podcast. This is self-promotion. Well, it's my podcast, but
go for it. Yeah.
Alice Solner talks about universal design, and she wrote a whole book on that, and it was a couple episodes ago. But I mean, she's an expert on that, and that's those metaphors come from her. And you know, and she got me to think, like, how do you create a classroom that, those, what a kid sees as deficits, or maybe what other teachers, like, they're a non-factor. They can be a non-factor, and they can also support more learning happening. Cause now all of a sudden we're thinking there's many ways to express your learning. And now there's many ways that I can have understanding because I'm seeing what other people are able to do. Like, you're creating this community of practice. That's amazing. Right.
Oh, so true. Yeah. Yeah. And I think a lot of that, you know, when we first hear universal design learning, a lot of things come to mind in terms of like, oh yeah, we should have our PDFs, you know, accessible in terms of having readers, PDF readers, and these kind of things. But to be able to go beyond that and say, well, what about like the conceptual understanding that I could, the net that I could use to find and see more conceptual understanding rather than just like providing concrete, like, I don't know, assignments.
No, absolutely. And that's where I thought we had some comment, like seeing we had some common thoughts on that, and like having that asset-based perspective of students, but then you're also saying like that sense of belonging. I thought those were like these sort of common thoughts between us. Yeah.
Because I think when we focus, or when the focus is on deficit, that just immediately can turn students away.
Oh yeah. Because I mean, we kind of joke about it, but a lot of people all of a sudden, like, if you say like, enter a math classroom, like, what's your deficit? I'm not a math person. And like, okay, if that's,
Yeah.
All right. Now, how do we deal with that? Versus saying like, no, you have lots of ways that you express yourself as a doer of mathematics, and we're going to pull those out, and you're going to get to use them. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah. Along those lines, I had the student this last quarter who one of my classes is synchronous, and we were looking at doing some just kind of, for me, basic simplification of fractions or of certain equations or expressions. And I said something like, oh, we just factor out the 6. And he was like, factor out? Like he just hadn't used that language. Right. And so he later met with me in an office hour and just told me how how upset that made him feel. He felt really like, oh, I don't know this word, and so I don't belong here, and all of these things. And we had a great conversation about, how, oh, well, in my experience as a professor, like I've just seen this a lot. And so, I shouldn't have used that word if that's not something you've seen or are familiar with. And like just having that kind of conversation. And, but then later, like I was just looking at his final project, and he looked at, it was some statistical analysis, and he's a YouTuber, and he has like a lot of followers, and he looked at, so the assignment was to, find data that included 2 quantitative variables and make some graphs and draw some analysis. And he used some of his own videos. He compared like length of video to percentage watched.
Oh yeah.
And this project is like, it's amazing. It's like, and I think because he was able to bring his own interest and his own, ideas and bring a project and a topic that he was genuinely curious about, and that also was beneficial in his work. Just really, I could really see him, and having a assignment where it's like, okay, factor out the 9 or simplify this expression. He's not seen there. Yeah. He is doing what I have told him to do rather than what he is inspired to do. So I think that it was just, I just, before we talked, was looking at his final, and I just was really impressed with his work. So.
Well, you think about that too, because you allowed him to do that. I'll bet on it that that's not where the math stopped, where his final was turned in, where he's doing that. I mean, he's still doing math on that because he's a YouTuber. He wants to figure out how to be a better YouTuber.
Totally.
And he's probably sharing that. Hey, when my videos are this length, they're humming, right? They're being watched more often.
Yeah. Yeah. And so he can take that work with him. He can continue to think about it. Exactly.
Yeah. And so like you think about some of the things, like there's that asset-based perspective. There's a sense of belonging. I see what I'm doing in my class. Or I see that what I'm doing in this class makes a difference in my own life. And now they'll be looking, the switches are flipped on, and I can see like, well, where is math elsewhere in my life? Not just this compartmentalized thing. I passed this class and now I'm done with it. No. Now it's a part of who you are.
Yeah. Or I'm never going to use the word factor. I'm never going to simplify expressions. Why do I need this?
Absolutely. One of the things that I saw too is just the connecting thoughts from each of our different briefs. And again, you're talking about all the, these different things that people can do in order to advance in their teaching, trying to achieve more equitable outcomes, and thinking about, again, I talked about before, providing the space in order to do that is good. But also there's something that was in your brief that I wanted to highlight, the message, I think you talked about a vision statement of the department
for departments.
Yeah. Having that visible. And I want to talk to you about that a little bit. So, because I think that is, so like, sometimes when we look at School of Eds or something like that, they'll talk about mission and vision statements and like, what do they actually mean? Right. What do they say? And what does that actually mean with regards to action? And so I like that you're saying like, hey, make it visible, put it out there, and put it out there so that it's almost like so people can call you on it. I don't know. Like, is that what you're kind of saying? Like, hey, if this is what we've put out there on our letterhead or whatever, like if we're actually going to do this, what does this look like in our classrooms? I don't know. Can you speak a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So this suggestion came from work that my department has done at Sonoma State. I think it was maybe a couple years ago, we wanted to change up our mission statement. And so, we took a few department meetings or time at some department meetings to really revise what we wanted to project out there. And so what we really focused on, maybe we can link the mission in the show notes because I don't have it memorized.
Nice.
But it starts with saying, here at Sonoma State University, we welcome, people from a variety of, cultural backgrounds and experiences to creatively or collaboratively take part in create a collaborative mathematical environment, something of this sort. So there's, really a welcoming of or an explicit attention to welcoming everyone from all backgrounds to take place in this collaborative environment. So kind of those two focuses, inclusive and collaborative. And so what I've done, and I think some of my colleagues as well have on the top of my syllabus, I have this statement.
Nice.
So, and sometimes I change it in this classroom, we welcome people from, all backgrounds and experiences to creatively collaborate in mathematics. And I have it there. And it could be something that some students will read, but that's how I start my class on day one. I say, welcome everyone, welcome to this classroom where we accept everyone, I go through, I just read it out loud to them. And I think that helps to kind of set the culture in the classroom right away as well. It's not okay, here's a syllabus. You need this book. You need to do these things. You need to pass these tests. Okay, write it down now or else, you're going to fail. You're already behind. Too late,
Yeah.
It's really let's just take a moment to pause and just say, I see you and you're welcome here.
Yeah. Look right, look left. One of you won't be here.
Yeah.
Right. It's not that.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
No,
and so we have it on our website, of course, but I think having it in the syllabus just helps it to bring the message actually to the students.
Yeah. Well, then you're talking about all these things where you can see that in action. Right. And I think that's the point. We've done some things with our education majors where they're doing a portfolio and they have a philosophy statement, which always starts off the same for most of them. It's love kids and I want to teach them well. Right. It starts off that way. And as they keep going and they have this reflection on action and kind of this philosophy and then their practice, you get to see it flesh out and change into something sophisticated, like what you're saying. So then you're kind of with the end product and say, well, hey, here's this thing, and I'm going to make this statement. And now throughout this semester, you're going to see how I'm going to back it up with what I'm doing in this class. And so it is kind of I'm putting it out there. I'm already saying this is it. Now I have to live up to it. And that is kind of bold, but it's also, it might be reassuring for that kid that's in this class and maybe my dad always scared me to death when he said he was great at math till he got to calculus. And then, so I always when I got into calculus, I was kind of scared because I'm oh my God,
this is going to be it. Yeah.
This is it. The show's over. Someone's going to be coming you don't belong in here. But to have those kids that or even to think my first modern algebra class, I got my notebook down over here where it's got symbols I can't even imagine. I can't remember what they all stand for, but that I remember doing I can't believe I'm on the edge of my understanding of everything. I'm still going though.
They haven't caught me yet.
Yeah. And so there's a pretty exposed sort of way, and to have someone say something like that at the beginning of your mathematical adventure is kind of reassuring. So I appreciate you doing that.
Yeah.
What? And any other question? Sorry, go for it.
Oh, well, I've had students comment on aspects of my class or those types of aspects of my class. So something else I do on every exam, you have at the beginning, and, I'd love to break away from exams and still working on it, giving myself time to grow. But most of my classes, there is an exam. And at the beginning, I have a bullet points of instructions, make sure you read everything. You can use this, you can use that, take your time. But my bullet I always include is, this exam is not a measure of your worth or intelligence. This exam is one way to demonstrate some of what you've learned so far this term. And I've had students comment on that as well. They've said that in student evals and things like that, they say, after reading that, it really helped me relax with the exam. And so that's another way that I try to carry out this message throughout the term of, you're welcome here. This is not your performance in this class or, however your activity in this class is not is not all of you. You are so big, and this class is one way of showing up here, or showing yourself, just so that they acknowledge that I am trying to see them more.
So I got some to share on this, and it was sort of the same thing. Is like, what do we do to, like, what is the think about what is the purpose of assessment? What are we trying to get out of it? Like for you to demonstrate some understanding. And so I had my cooperating teacher when I was back in 2000. Anyway, Joe Dye, and he was, again, he was on this podcast too, but we talked about celebrations of learning, right? So he never gave a test. He would have a celebration of learning.
That's great.
And I loved it. And so I took that, I stole that, and
that's great
from him. And he lovingly lets me have it. But like having a celebration of learning. And so I'm saying, no, I'm not testing you. I'm not saying like, do you know this? Do you know this? Versus, you know this? That's great. Oh, you know this? Like to again, that's like taking that asset-based perspective,
right?
Bringing it to the, and in my celebrations are not that strenuous when we're talking about that, but I still want to see like, hey, do we have demonstration of these objectives and things like that? Because we want to celebrate those things, but we want to see where we're at. Because if we don't have those, and we know that if you want to leave this class in good shape, I got to make sure that we do some things in order to get that. So, and then we will celebrate that later. So we can do that. But anyway, like using those sort of terms, I remember we had our first celebration, and again, it was all online and this past year and with one of our classes. And I know like the anxiety level just goes down, like, oh, it's a celebration. Like it's still, I mean, it's just, even if it was just a name, even though they know in the back of their head, like this is maybe a test, but like, no, and trying to back it up. This celebration of learning, here's what I want to celebrate, because I know we've done this stuff and I want you to show me what you know. And so having that sort of perspective, I think, can help. And like, it maybe, there might be some math professor that rolling their eyes at that. Okay, well, still, how do you bring that mindset to like what you're saying, like the perspective that you're bringing to your students using those words, can just be like, just bring the anxiety down a little bit. So they can actually show what they know,
Yeah. I love that celebration of learning. And I think too, like you said, some math professors might roll their eyes, but I mean, an assessment we've assumed students have learned something. So now they're demonstrating it. So might as well celebrate that. Might as well call it something that is, appreciating their hard work and their learning. And then I think that's something students can take away with them. They're building a deck and they're making measurements and, oh, hey, this worked out. I was able to, measure these things and build this thing. And like, that's a celebration. I learned, I appreciate, what happened. So I love that perspective.
So any other questions we have? I asked mine about the mission statement. I wanted to ask about that. Did you have any more?
Let's see. I do. Let me just take a look here. Well, so I did have maybe not exactly related to the brief, but in terms of equity considerations, specifically for online classes. So I know a lot of more schools are opening up more in the fall, but there's still a lot of classes running online. And I think that's kind of where a lot of higher ed trend is going. So I was wondering if you had any like special considerations for online classes. I know we touched on this a little bit, but maybe ways of helping students be more seen in that world and providing more access.
Yeah. So it's like another shameless plug. So for the Math Teaching podcast, we did a whole series of book club chats with this book called Teaching Math at a Distance with Teresa Wills. She's from George Mason University. And she's like an expert on teaching math online. And and I didn't know this, but I was exposed to a bunch of her resources like a year ago when a friend of mine, Jen Wolf at the University of Arizona, she's in the math department, was sharing with me all these resources on teaching. So like using a lot of Google Slides and interactions around math problems and things like that, and trying to think. So anyway, we introduced to Teresa. We did a podcast on the Teaching Math Teaching podcast with Teresa, and then she had the book. We did the book club, and now an episode kind of wrapping that up is going to be published in a couple of weeks on the Teaching Math Teaching podcast feed. That being said, I got a lot of different perspectives from Teresa on some things. So like, for example, teaching online can also, sometimes we think about just the internet access. Yes, that is an issue, and we need to come up with that. And just how do we get access to good Wi-Fi? But then also thinking like, well, how do we create more access online? So for example, we're showing each other's video right now. Like, yes, it's nice in a conversation to see each other's video, but it might not be necessary in an online class environment to actually see video. Like, oh, I want to see their faces. Well, do they need to see your face?
Yeah.
Right. If you're doing something through the Google Slides where they're interacting, you just want to see that they're engaged. Well, there's different ways to show engagement that don't take as much bandwidth, right? That provides more access.
That's a good point.
So thinking about it from that perspective, or also thinking like I have a big barrier right now with like physically getting manipulatives to my elementary teachers so that they can experience some things. We have some here, but then getting access to all of them is kind of tough. Well, there's virtual manipulatives. They're not the best, right? Like I want them to know that physical manipulatives are really good for kids, but to get them exposed to it now, the world is our oyster because the internet, even in my face-to-face class, we can still use the online environment to bring all these virtual manipulatives to play where we can actually and things. And like allowing choice for kids, like, hey, show me how you could put these two numbers together. You can use a number line. You can use the base 10 blocks. You can use all these different ways. Similar sort of thing at a college level. You're talking about using Desmos or different GeoGebra, all these different ways that they could express themselves. You show their thinking. Like the internet can actually provide more access to some of those things. So like my perspective is evolved a little bit where I'm seeing like the interactions, like how can someone participate in my class? Like think about if we're on a Zoom and we have some Google Slides, they can communicate over the audio. They can communicate in the chat. They can communicate by showing, their manipulation of a slide if I've provided them that space to do that. Like there's so many ways that they can engage and into this classroom now that a lot of those I can still bring into a face-to-face environment, but like thinking from an online space, there's a lot going on there.
Effective. In how they're contributing. Go ahead. Like traditionally it'd be like, well, I need to see that they're working. And so I see that they're working by seeing that they have their video on or seeing their face. Right. But it's like, well, there's a lot more maybe that we could see. And then also in the asynchronous platform too. Opening that up to more, either maybe having opportunities for students to create a short presentation or a video or, show work in a Google slide or a Jamboard or some of these other things too. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. And even just to, Teresa just opened my eyes a lot too with like looking at a set of Google slides that's, hey, each group has a slide that they're showing their work on. And so even jumping around to different, groups and like, I think I can zoom around in my little rolly chair around a classroom. I can see one, maybe two groups at a time, see what they're doing. But there I could be in a Zoom room looking and engaging with or listening to a conversation while at the same time seeing, oh, wow, groups 3 and 4 are doing something similar to what I'm hearing where this group, group 6 isn't doing anything. I'm going to pop over to that group. And so now even to think like, not even just think like, well, do they have an issue or, oh no, they're just having a really good conversation. All right, now, hey, can you put something on the board? So it's like, even a better way of doing that sort of juggling around.
Seeing their work. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, that's that podcast is coming out. Is that right?
Yeah, the podcast is out. And then we had all the book chats, and we'll put them in the show notes.
Great.
Shameless promotion of lots of stuff here. But any additional thoughts that you had on our conversation here?
So I do have a couple more questions if we have time. Okay. So going back, I guess, to kind of that, going back to this assessment-based perspective of students. So something you wrote in your brief, Joel, is that, so rather than having this deficit perspective, consider instead what assets students bring to the classroom and how to leverage those assets to best build their relationship with mathematics. And so my curiosity or my question is, how does this look like what does this look like for you in your classroom? So do you try to find individual student assets, or are your assignments such that, students can bring whatever asset they are sort of want to the room, or is there a certain asset inventory that you do? I'm just curious what that looks like.
I mean, I have done those like the leadership inventory where you get them to identify what animal they are. Are they a lion?
Really cool.
A lion, a beaver, otter, and a golden retriever. A lot of teachers are golden retrievers, but there's some lions in there. And so you've got two lions in a group that can be, lions are going to butt heads sometimes. So it's like knowing that, okay, I might have to make a choice to back off here and let this other person take the leads. But then also knowing that everyone has a role there. So knowing the otter, you can kind of guess an otter is kind of a fun loving sort of person that's going to hey, your role might be to rally your group. Hey, let's get going on this. All right, here we go. I got the time. And whatever, that's one very simple one that I've used with my high school students as well. But then also seeing well, how do you best take in information, right? Or then how do you best express information? It's kind of like the love language of learning, right? And so thinking about that and identifying what those things are. But then, another thing is just to provide parameters of what the task is, and then letting them choose how they want to. So the best way for me to teach my teachers how to teach is to let them teach. And so we have them design these little mini lessons, and we did these virtual teaching groups that worked really well this past year, where they taught a little lesson to their group. And you should see, I could have said, hey, do this, this, and this, you need to select. The only thing I said is you need to select an open-ended task that opens into it, and then, allows kids or your peers to do some thinking around it, and then you to talk about it. And there's some more to it than that, but I mean, and then evaluating them kind of on their teaching, where they would self-evaluate, and the creativity that would happen. I could have shown some lessons and just have them observe it, but having them do it, then you'd see they're bringing in all this information. I learned so much about my students because they're bringing in some themselves into those things. If providing the space in order for that to happen, just like you did with your student in their final, able to use their YouTube, analytics, those sorts of things, allowing them to bring they're going to use their assets, allowing them to do what they want. They're going to bring those in to play in order to accomplish something. So one, you get to know your students better, but two, they come up with amazing things if you give them the space to do so.
Yeah.
I know, does that help?
Something that I struggle with in that is balancing that open-endedness with communicating expectations. So I do try. And so what I try to do, I guess, is just to, allow students to really have a lot of control in the content that they're looking at.
Yeah.
Right. But then provide parameters, as you said, I guess, parameters that then help to communicate those expectations. Yeah. But that's still something that I often am, still trying to work on and develop, creating a rubric that is, structured enough, but also open enough.
Right. That's what I was going to say, is creating that rubric. And so for these virtual teaching groups, so I wanted what's the quality control? They needed to have a lesson plan, which we gave a template for. They needed to identify the standard and objective that they're going to, that they're going to use.
Yeah.
They needed to use Google Slides because we were going to do some virtual teaching. I'm saying you need to use slides. I don't know how you use them, but you need to use them.
Yeah.
And then I can't remember what the other thing is, but anyway, then they were going to evaluate each other on these and like, I didn't care how they did on this evaluation, but they were going to be evaluated by their peers. And it was like, did everyone know what they were supposed to do? Was it organized? Was there like a flow to the lesson? Did they allow them to communicate with each other, or were they just talking at the students? And then were there higher order questions being asked? And so they're trying to shoot for these sorts of like, pedagogical targets while doing something around they had to use an open-ended task. That was the other thing that they had to use. They had to use, and we had a list of like resources where they could find one around their standard. Yeah. And so those parameters, so that provided a good fence in order for great things to happen. But it's like, all you had to do was do those things. You got the credit, like those, like use the slides, the open-ended task, the lesson, but then you could have totally bombed out on your teaching, but the peer pressure, you wanted to do better. And then we said, hey, and then next time find one of those things you didn't do as well on and just get better at it. And like, oh man,
that's awesome.
The way that they responded was amazing. And it was just like, you saw people get better and talk sophisticated about their teaching. Like, yeah, I had people cooperate or communicate with each other, but I could ask better questions, like and so people are like writing little Post-its with like
growth.
Hey, blank, tell me about blank's thinking on that problem. And like, so they have this like ready on their side of their computer, ready to go to talk to each other. So,
cool.
That's pretty cool.
That's awesome. Awesome.
So any additional thoughts? And we're going to wrap this up in the next few.
I think that's a great conversation, Joel.
Yeah. And again, lots of links. There's lots of resources that will be shared in the show notes. And I think each of us put in our briefs, so highlighted some resources to put in there. So definitely lots of good stuff to look at in both of those. And then just in general, the getting started with equity for academic department leaders. It's kind of like, hey, if you're going to sit down and have a conversation with a department chair, what would you want to share with them? And they did several like departments that they used that did similar work to what Natalie and I did. But so this was great. Anything to promote, Natalie, before we head out?
I will say, so my department at Sonoma State is currently, they're starting a grant this year, a project for transforming post-secondary STEM education. Nice. So this is a professional development program that they're starting to help faculty investigate their implicit biases and be more inclusive educators. So I'm really excited about this work because, a lot of work or some work in this direction has taken place at the K through 12 level, but less so in terms of professional development or department change at the higher ed level. So I'm really excited to be a part of this program. I'll be one of the participants in it, going through a workshop this summer, and then some other sort of studies and focus groups this coming year. So I'm really excited to be a part of that change.
Nice. Excellent. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, I just want to thank you for the time. It's like one of those opportunities where you get a chance to introduce yourself to somebody, you find you have some connections, and then you get to have great conversations around an important topic about promoting equity in math education. So I'm just...
And I'd love to continue the conversation if any of your listeners are interested in, or interested in chatting or have other, ideas. So you could also throw my email in the show notes. I don't know if that's
I know you got a nice blog,
whatever, but
you got a nice blog too, right? We'll send me a link. We'll put that in the notes as well. So that'll be great.
Great. Will do.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for all your work, and look forward to a future conversation.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Joel.
All right. There it is. What I believe was cool about this conversation between Natalie and I was that we came in with a similar understanding of equity, but had very different experiences in getting to this point. You heard a little bit about her background. Man, I've told you so much about my background in this episode of this podcast, but even if you haven't there, it was different. So But even with the common vocabulary, we still had some ways we could enlighten each other given our different perspectives. And I think that's what we should be doing. I over and over again, I say one of the great things about this podcast is just to have great conversations and record them and share them. And that's kind of the point, right? And so, I put it out to you. If you're thinking about, and you should be thinking about, how do you make this world a more equitable place? How do we think about what are things we can do in our current context to move towards a better place, a better world, right? Thinking about steps you could do. I mean, it's going to start with conversations. It's about getting to know your neighbor. It's about thinking about how can you make this world a little bit better place, and what are the actions that you can do, taking steps towards that. And again, building relationships is, I think, always going to be at the forefront, and that's going to start probably with some conversations. So hopefully that's something, some good news for you to share, and hopefully maybe you can take some steps toward that. Love to hear about it. So if you ever want to connect, you can connect with Joel at AmazonPlanet.com. Always love to have good conversations. So if you know someone maybe I should have a good conversation with, I'd always love to hear about that. Now, if you are looking for ways to support the podcast, that is one way you could do that by, connecting me with folks you think I should be having conversations with. But if you're looking for other ways to support outside of some of the things that we talked about here in this podcast, and by the way, show notes for this episode of the podcast can be found at AmazonPlanet.com/episode 47. Never want to forget that. So show notes again at AmazonPlanet.com/episode 47. But if you're looking for ways to support the podcast, you can subscribe to the podcast wherever you get podcasts so that the latest episode is always available whenever you're ready to listen. Rate and or review the podcast through your podcast provider. Subscribe to the podcast, or subscribe to the Amazon Planet download, which contains teaching resources and updates from Amazon Planet. We're going to have lots of resources related to some of the book clubs that I've been doing through another podcast, the Teaching Math Teaching Podcast. But anyway, that's coming up in a couple weeks, so you'll hear about that soon enough. You can also follow at Amazon Planet on Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, or like the Amazon Planet Facebook page. You can also check out the Amazon Planet store or Amazon Planet bookshop. Links are in the footer at AmazonPlanet.com, where your purchases support the production costs of the podcast. In conclusion, thank you for listening to this episode of the Amazon Planet podcast. Thanks to Natalie for sharing her time and expertise. Thanks to Matt Mifflin, as always, for the music in this episode. And finally, thank you to all of you out there who are seeking to teach better and be the good in the world by investing in the lives of others. This world is a better place because you have decided to use the gifts you have been given to serve others. Thank you for all that you do. Peace.